Wonder is perhaps the thing that has driven human progress more than anything. And certainly my work with glass is fueled by wonder still after about 3 decades of working more or less full-time with this material. I find that I still learn a lot. One of the really fundamental drivers for me is the joy of that making, and also recognizing how lucky I am to be working with material which is so sort of fun. There are lots of processes which are difficult, and this is difficult to learn, but actually it's sort of easy. Once you're sort of good at it, it's very fun. It's hard and hot and noisy, but it is kind of miraculous. And so wonder, that sort of questioning curiosity about how things work and what you can do. I can imagine people 3,500 years ago starting to work with glass because of accidents that happened in metallurgy or in ceramic work, and then pursuing this kind of curiosity about it. I think that you can see the progress of that technology and imagine that that really was fueled all the way along by this wonder about what is possible, what might be possible, and why these things work. I usually start planning a work on a sort of small scale as a thumbnail. So I'll draw a page, just a small page with lots of little sketches, just to get that sort of basic idea of the forms. And it'll almost always be composite form. I'll do a bunch of drawings, little sketchy things, and then I'll decide on one of them which I like the best. And then I'll start to select some of the pre-made glass rods that I have pre-made, they're not bought. And that's one of the things that I have a kind of sense of pride about, is it takes about, I'd say, maybe 10 years to be really good at, depending on how much practice you have. You could go quicker. You could do a few of them after not very long, but certainly helps to have experience. I've made these complex decorated rods, and often they're twisted because that's a sort of trick where you can twist the glass, and then the transparency of the base cylinder does weird optical things with the opaque or transparent colours inside when it's twisted. It's a kind of bizarrely wonderful thing which you can't imagine a human could ever have done. I've made a lot of these rods, and then I go through my sort of collection of those and sometimes find I need a specific one extra, so I'll make that, bring that back to the studio, and then I chop up small pieces of those, and then I can make small parts, and I bring them back to the drawing and often have to redraw again. So eventually I have a drawing which is full size to match those actual parts which I've made, and then I bring that drawing and the parts, little flowers and eyes and birds and different things, and I bring them to the studio and reheat those pieces and any other bits that I need, and then I work out methodically with my assistant in what order we're going to stick it all together, and additional bigger things will be made and then kept hot, and then eventually I make the biggest part and stick it all together. There seems to be a popular kind of idea about glass blowing in which it's very spontaneous, and some of the things I do are spontaneous, but generally it's very, very planned, and I'm trying to stick to the plan and make it look like the drawing. The reason for that is that I've got all these parts, and if I don't get the measurements right, they crash into each other, and the composition doesn't work. I sort of have to stick to the drawing. I find it's better if I do here. So it's quite methodical. It's pretty well accepted and established that around 1430 in Venice they developed the recipe and the process, the technique for making a very clear glass, and it had been a dream for thousands of years to be able to make a colourless, clear glass. In order to make these patterns, you really need a clear base glass, and then they also developed fairly soon after that. So that clear glass was called Cristallo, and it was designed to replicate rock crystal, which was a very highly sought after mineral, and rich people had rock crystal vessels. To be able to make glass things with rock crystal meant that instead of spending 6 months carving a bowl, you could just blow one in 20 minutes. It's incredible. But also, because glass is so ductile, you could do all these other tricky things, adding glass and pinching it and twisting it, and you could make convoluted shapes, which you could never do through carving crystal. Then they developed this very hard white glass, which you could stretch. You could coat it in the clear and then stretch it very, very fine, and it would still stay opaque and white. And so once they had those two things, they could combine these rods of white with the clear glass and then twist it and make these very fine, lacy looking rods, which then can be rolled up into a cylinder and then blown to make whatever you can blow with glass. There were attempts for hundreds of years to keep this technique secret. There's a sort of myth that glassblowers were locked up on Murano and that they couldn't go anywhere else to take these secrets or they would be killed. But this is not true. Actually, the furnaces were turned off every year, and so the for summer, for rebuilding and just for a break, it was too hot for one thing, and so they would these glassblowers would travel everywhere they could go and keep making glass. But they could be fined. They certainly were not encouraged to go, but if they had gone, they needed to come back. So they weren't punished too harshly. They needed to continue to work. So anyway, these rods that I fell in love with as an art school undergrad, and which I immediately realised could be used to make incredible marbles, are twisted glass, and there are colours which are suspended in the clear, and then when you twist them you have this weird optical trick where you can see the front and the back, so it looks like a lattice, and there are an infinite number of variations that you could do if you have the kind of choice of colours that are available to a contemporary glass artist. But there are just a few basic forms. So there's one that is sort of flat, and so when you twist it, it makes a helix. And then there's one that's got the canes on the outside, and when you twist it, it makes it looks like a lattice. And so, and you can combine those. So there are lots of different things you can do to innovate within that. But it's also just fun to learn it and to practice it and to get it right and to get it wrong. I went through a research period after having spent 15 years as a production manager at JamFactory. I spent about 10 years doing sort of basic training at art school and then in the training program at JamFactory, and then travelling around between art schools and to America and Japan, working with different people who were inspiring and incredible makers, learning a lot. And then I was offered the job as the production manager, and so I stayed at the Jam making bottles and bowls and jugs and vases and trophies, so many trophies, for years and years. So it almost was as if I was continuing my training for that 15 years, and but in a very technically interesting way, very varied. And also I had, as part of my deal, I had a session 4 hours a week to make whatever I wanted to make, and so I was able to continue developing experimental work for a long time. And so then I came to a point when I had made too many light shades, and I realised I could only make so much stuff in my life, and I wanted to sort of make make it count, make it mean something more. And so I did this research for about 5 years, doing a PhD. And so I was able to then do a lot of reading about the themes that had been driving my work, which I kind of had a intuitive understanding of, but hadn't really read about. And I wasn't able to articulate what those things were or delve deeply into them. And so during this time, I was able to identify the themes that were really important to me and find out connections between them and also more about them, and also, importantly, make additional objects in response, direct response to that reading. I was talking to Lisa Slade from the Art Gallery of South Australia about the Cabinet of Curiosities, the Wunderkammer, these princely collections of treasures, and a lot of them were wonderful things which were bridging science and nature and art, and a lot of them were anomalies, the natural things, so uncategorizable things like coral, which was apparently a cross between a mineral and a plant. So I was able to go to Europe and see a lot of these things where they are held in these big treasure vaults, and that inspired more things. One of the themes that I have always worked with is humour, and it's partly because my work is actually fueled by dread to a certain extent, and the catastrophic changes to the environment which are more and more apparent and which have kind of come to popular consciousness in the span of my career from the mid-90s, early 90s until now, and it's been named the Anthropocene. So I have this terrible unease about the state of the planet, and I know that I'm contributing to that by being a glassblower. But also I really love that industry, and I think a lot of the things that glass has enabled us to do has partly allowed us to understand the problem. So a lot of the scientific apparatus which lets us see nature on a macro and a micro scale are available to us because of glass. And also I just think that there are a lot of beautiful and wonderful things about human industry. So I'm proud to continue these traditions of melting and making things out of glass, even though I can see that there are problems with it. And so one of the things that I have done in my practice is offset my carbon impact. So I'm interested in addressing this environmental pickle that we find ourselves in, but I find that I certainly am drawn to humorous things. I like to laugh. I think things, funny things are more interesting than serious things, and so I want to work with humour. So I was really surprised to find out that during the Renaissance there is a very rich body of work that was conducted by a bunch of people, including glass blowers, to make sort of practical jokes out of glass. And so some of them were visually hilarious just because it was a drinking vessel shaped like a shoe or a pickle or a musical instrument or a piece of fruit. And there are hundreds, thousands probably. I've seen maybe 5,000 of these drawings in their original pen and wash in these archives in Italy. Probably, I'd say, 1,200 or more are funny, and some of them are also funny because they're difficult to use. And so I think the idea was that you would give them to your guest and then they would spill the wine on themselves as they were trying to drink out of it, and then everyone would roll around laughing. And so this is like a popular entertainment for rich people at that time. But actually some of the woodblock prints that I've seen show like bar scenes, rowdy bar scenes, where there are people drinking out of funny shaped drinking vessels. And you still see in Austria there's boot shaped vessels. And I'm really particularly interested in representations of animals. I was really surprised to find that there's a strong historical connection between my contemporary work, which is dealing with glass, vessel making, representation, animals, nature, and humour, and these drawings from 400 years ago. Yes, very surprising. And some of these drawings look as if I might have drawn them. I feel like I was incredibly lucky when I went to art school in the early 90s in Canberra. They'd had the furnace running for only about 3 years. It's long enough to work through teething troubles and for there to develop a bit of a skill base. They did have, in the very early days of the furnace, some people who are now big names in the international glass scene who came through early, and they were influenced by some of these Venetians who were openly teaching Venetian techniques in America for the first time. Italian maestros were coming to America and starting to teach. At that point, there was very little shared language, but there was enormous hunger in the American art glass scene for technique, and people say that there was an enormous freedom offered to these Venetian maestros to come, who did come to America, because the kind of designing that they had done in factories was limited because they were working within this structure which was hundreds of years old and had a very big team. And anyway, as I was starting to blow glass, there was a great communication and technical exchange between America and Canberra and the rest of Australia. And Italian technique was disseminating throughout the international glass community. I was learning from people who had just been to America and had come back and needed people to help them to make these things with these techniques. So they needed to train me to be able to assist them. And so I learnt a lot of things which 10 years earlier were unknown outside of Italy. And so pretty much immediately fell in love with the technique. I mean, the first time I saw glass blowing was a 3-person team making goblets in the Venetian style, and I just immediately wanted to do it. And so, that's really never left me. And so for a 18 or 17-year-old, it's incredibly lucky to see something that you just love and want to do, and then to be able to do it is great. And then to be taught how to do it by people who really know what they're doing is amazing. I was very lucky. I was also able to practice a lot of these techniques. So one of the things that I saw as a first year was a guy who had come back from this school, summer school in America, and the class was taught by somebody who was a chandelier maker from Italy. And so a lot of the forms behind me, like this, it's chandelier making technique. And so, and it all happens very quickly. So for me to see that the first time, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because you get a blob of glass and then suddenly it's a plant. It's amazing. One of the really interesting things about those forms is that the process of glass making has some say in what the final thing is going to be. If you make something quickly with hot glass, it will be stylized in a certain way, particularly if you're using the tools which have been developed for glass. You can't touch this thing, so it's not like modeling. And yeah, so it's a really interesting way that natural forms become stylized when they're worked quickly with hot glass. And I sort of really like that. There are certain Italian designers who use that incredibly well, and it's a really sort of fresh and really quirky view of nature, because it's mediated through that material. Over time, my drawings have become more like things I can actually make in glass, because I have the experience of trying to make them. So the two things are sort of talking to each other. And that's one of the really interesting things about working with that Venetian, because you can make incredibly precise rods and then make a really lumpy looking thing out of them. And I think that is so funny, because there's this level of precision and then this level of kind of looseness, and combining those is really hilarious, I think. And then, adding sort of cute and sinister things and just messing with people's perceptions of what they're looking at. And glass is a really good material for that, because it is like a trick optically. There are so many things you can do. It's like, is it there or is it not there? It is an anomalous material because it is neither liquid nor solid. Technically, it is a fifth state of matter, or a sixth if you count plasma. As an undergraduate, almost every photo that I saw of glass was in a horizonless studio and just an object in space. And then there was one of the other students who was doing a postgrad, and one of her portfolio pictures was a bullfighter goblet, and it was in a painted arena. And so the idea of presenting glass within a context and not just in nowhere land of space immediately opened up as an exciting possibility. So I started to make dioramas, and growing up in Canberra, I went to the War Memorial and saw their dioramas, and then some natural history museums as well. And you'd go and see an exhibit of some kind of animal, say an Arctic bird or something. Yeah, albatrosses, let's say, on cliffs or something like this. And you'd see there was modelled areas like plaster rocks and bits of twig and stuff, and then this incredible painted backdrop, and then all the stuffed animals. So this is the kind of thing that I guess I find that the most exciting display that I can imagine. And I want to include this kind of spectacle with the work. And it can be confusing, for sure. Like, I think that it's not necessarily a smart idea if you're trying to sell something, because people don't quite know what they're looking at, or what's for sale, I suppose. But, who cares? Because it's exciting making those things just to photograph. I then quickly wanted to exhibit these objects within a kind of scenery, and then because they are all characters, they're all kind of upsetting the notion of being objects. They're all looking back at the audience, and they're all, I think of them all as somewhat sentient. They are communicating with each other and inhabiting this space, so it sort of makes sense to me to build them. Like, they feel lonely if they're on a white plinth. Although, sometimes I'll do that and it's fine, but I find it more satisfying if they have at least a nod toward some kind of context. So one of the other influences early on in my work is Margaret Dodd, who, when I was a kid, we had the book 9 Artist Potters, where she had these ceramic cars. One of them is just totally covered in grass. One of them is an echidna. And that really stayed with me, those images. And so I was thinking about, when I was in my 20s and in Japan, I saw this car on a hill which was covered with vines. It was being overgrown, and it apparently was returning to nature. It was rusting away back into the hillside. I found that a very hopeful image, given that cars have had such a devastating effect on the planet. that nature sort of doesn't care in some ways. Human things generally can be reclaimed. It's like the triumph of nature. This is one of the kind of interesting things which I'm trying to communicate, is that long scale view of time. I think it's really intriguing that glass is this material which is made out of minerals which are transformed and which is going to last for hundreds of thousands of years, and that geological time is so freaking vast, it's hard to wrap your head around.